It started with a ripple in the water and a soft chuckle from my grandfather as he reeled in another modest-sized bass from the lake behind our house, a place he'd been fishing at for over 20 years. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting an orange hue across the calm water, and the morning birds were singing their usual chorus while Grandpa sat quietly on his folding chair, worn fishing hat tilted just enough to shade his eyes, and a small tackle box at his feet. He wasn't bothering anyone. It wasn't hurting the environment. He was simply doing what gave him peace, casting his line into the same lake he had helped maintain back when this neighborhood was just a collection of dirt roads and fresh concrete foundations. But now things were different. Now we had an HOA, and worse, we had Karen. If you've ever had to deal with a power-hungry neighbor who abuses their HOA title like it's a badge of law enforcement, then you know exactly what kind of trouble this story's about to dive into. Before you hear how it all spiraled into police lights and legal threats over a fishing rod, make sure to subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, because if you think this is bad, just wait until you hear what Karen tried next. Grandpa had lived in the same lakefront house since the late 90s, long before the HOA even existed. Back then, the lake was considered a shared natural feature, and fenced, unrestricted, and respected by the handful of homeowners who had settled in the area. As the neighborhood grew and more houses sprouted up, a group of newer residents decided that an HOA would help keep property values high and order in place. Grandpa wasn't thrilled, but he didn't fight it either until they started trying to rewrite history. One of the first red flags came when new signage appeared near the lake, reading, HOA members only. No unauthorized fishing. That struck a nerve. Grandpa had watched that lake fill in over decades, planted reeds along the banks to protect against erosion, and even stocked fish from his own pocket back in the day. The lake, to him, wasn't an amenity, was a legacy. Karen, the current president of the HOA, had moved in just 3 years ago, but acted like she wrote the founding charter of the neighborhood. She walked around with her clipboard, issued citations for unauthorized shrubbery, and frequently reminded everyone that HOA rules were non-negotiable. Most of the neighborhood either feared her or just tolerated her passive-aggressive emails. But Grandpa wasn't like most of the neighborhood. He believed in standing his ground when something felt wrong. That morning, while he sat peacefully casting his line, Karen came marching across the grass, heels sinking slightly into the soft dirt, lips pressed tight and phone already in hand. I saw it from the back porch where I was drinking my coffee. Her arms were flailing as she yelled, "You can't fish here. This is restricted access." Grandpa didn't even look at her at first, just replied calmly, "Been fishing here longer than you've been alive, lady." That only fueled her anger. Karen demanded that he leave immediately and warned that she'd call the HOA board. Grandpa chuckled and told her to go right ahead. That's when she really snapped. "Then I'll call the police," she shouted. And to our disbelief, she did. Within 15 minutes, a patrol car rolled into the cul-de-sac, and 2 officers stepped out. One looked confused. The other looked annoyed, like they'd dealt with Karen before. I rushed out to meet them, trying to defuse things before it escalated. Karen was already ranting about trespassing, unauthorized use of HOA property, and refusing to comply with local regulations. Grandpa just sat there, rod still in hand, calm as ever. The officers approached him respectfully, asked a few questions, and Grandpa calmly explained that he had been fishing at that lake since before there were paved roads in the neighborhood. He even had photos of himself standing beside the water. Decades ago, pulled out a folder Grandpa kept in the house that had original property maps, dated photos, and even some early HOA newsletters that made reference to open fishing access. It was crystal clear Karen's claims had no legal ground. But she didn't stop. She demanded a citation be issued, accused Grandpa of being combative, and threatened to sue the HOA board if they didn't act. One of the officers, finally, had enough and politely told her that if she continued making false claims, she could face repercussions. You'd think that would have ended it. You'd be wrong. Later that evening, Karen sent out a neighborhood-wide email accusing Grandpa of creating a hostile environment and claiming she was personally threatened. Of course, there was zero evidence of that. Still, it rattled some of the neighbors. A few even began to whisper about HOA liabilities and possible fishing restrictions. Grandpa stayed quiet, but I could tell it wore on him. Started fishing. Less often, spending more time inside, and it hurt to see the one place that brought him peace now clouded by tension. I decided enough was enough. I started gathering support from longtime residents who remembered what the lake used to be. People who knew Grandpa and respected him. We drafted a petition to have the lake's fishing rights restored as open access for all homeowners, something that had been understood for years before. Karen rewrote the rules. Karen, of course, fought back hard. She accused us of attempting to dismantle the HOA's authority and even tried to fine residents for organizing a rogue petition. But the truth was catching up to her. In the coming days, things would escalate in ways no one expected. Karen would go even further too, try and punish Grandpa, and we would dig deeper into her actions. What we discovered would not only clear Grandpa's name, but would shake the foundation of the HOA itself. Don't miss what happens next, because what started as a fishing trip turned into a neighborhood revolution. Stay tuned, and in the meantime, make sure to subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel so you don't miss a single twist in this unbelievable true story. Grandpa hadn't even brought out his fishing rod the next morning. But that didn't stop Karen from showing up again, this time with a stack of printed papers in her hand and a neighbor following a few paces behind her. She wasn't just escalating, she was mobilizing. The paper she tried to hand me claimed that Grandpa had violated Section 12, Article 3 of the HOA Environmental Conduct Guidelines, which supposedly prohibited any unauthorized wildlife interaction, including fishing, bird, feeding, or even duck watching. I almost laughed. That guideline wasn't allow had access to the most recent HOA manual, and I'd read every page twice. I told her that, but she just smiled that smug Karen smile and said, "Well, it's under review to be added, and until then, we're operating under a temporary executive motion." That's when I realized she wasn't just bluffing anymore. She was actively inventing rules, counting on the fear and confusion she sowed to keep people from pushing back. Grandpa was inside watching from the window, his face unreadable, but I could tell it hurt. He loved this community. He had planted most of the trees along our street himself. Now the same neighborhood was turning cold toward him. Karen started going door to door that afternoon, spreading her version of the story. According to her, Grandpa had threatened her, resisted the police, and polluted the lake with old fishing gear. It didn't matter that none of it was true. Some neighbors, especially the newer ones, had no reason not to believe her. That's when we realized we needed to get ahead of this publicly. I decided to call a community meeting not through the HOA, which Karen controlled, but independently. I printed flyers, shared posts in the private neighborhood social group, and asked our longtime neighbors to show up and speak their truth. Grandpa wasn't interested at first. He said he didn't want to stir up more trouble, but after I showed him one of Karen's posts accusing him of being dangerous to children, he agreed. The meeting was held at the community park by the lake, the very spot Karen had said. He wasn't allowed to fish. We had a strong turnout. About 30 households came. I spoke first, calmly laying out the facts, showing copies of official HOA rules, and even playing a short video from my phone of the incident where Karen called the police. It clearly showed Grandpa doing nothing wrong. Then a few neighbors spoke. Mr. Richards from across the street, who said he used to fish with Grandpa 10 years ago and never had a problem. Mrs. Beckman, who'd been in the neighborhood since the early 2000s, shared how Grandpa had taught her grandson how to cast a line. Then Grandpa stood up. He didn't speak long. Just said he missed the days when community meant looking out for each other, not calling the cops because someone enjoyed a quiet morning by the water. There was a long pause after that silent, respectful end, then quiet clapping from the back that grew louder. Karen showed up halfway through, of course. She marched down the hill like she was walking into a courtroom and immediately started shouting that we were conducting an unauthorized gathering. When someone pointed out that this was public space maintained by HOA funds, she waved a printed rule book and insisted we disband. But this time, people didn't cower. People asked questions. What rule exactly prohibits community gatherings? Who approved these new fishing bans? When was the board meeting held to vote on them? Karen had no answers. What she did have was a meltdown. She began yelling about fines and violations and threatened to take legal action against anyone participating in this slanderous event. But the damage was done. Her grip on the neighborhood was cracking. The next day, 3 board members resigned. They had supported Karen for a while, but admitted that they hadn't been aware of how far she had gone. They even claimed that Karen was making decisions without them, using their names and emails without permission, and signing off on actions with forged digital signatures. One of them sent me an anonymous message saying, "We're done being her cover. She crossed too many lines." With half the board gone, the HOA's ability to enforce anything was temporarily frozen, and Karen went into panic mode. Over the next few days, she bombarded the HOA inbox with emails blaming a smear campaign and calling Grandpa a master manipulator. She said he had brainwashed the neighborhood and was staging a coup. But nobody believed her anymore. The newer neighbors started asking to see proof of the phishing violations she'd referenced. And when no documents could be produced, they slowly pulled away from her side. Even people who had once supported Karen now realized they had been fed a version of events that didn't match reality. She tried one last big move, contacting the HOA's legal liaison and requesting a formal cease and desist letter against Grandpa for a continued disruption of HOA peace. Without board consensus and proper documentation, they had no legal basis. That letter never materialized. Karen didn't know what to do next. Her tactics, once so feared, now made people roll their eyes. Her paranoia grew. She began recording conversations, installing motion lights on every corner of her house, and even filed a noise complaint against the neighbor kids playing basketball down the block. That's when people started whispering not about Grandpa, but about her. In the midst of all this, Grandpa finally went fishing again, just once, just to test the waters, both literally and socially. I walked him down to the lake and helped him set up his chair, and to my surprise, a few other neighbors joined us. They didn't fish, but they brought lawn chairs and snacks, sitting nearby in quiet solidarity. Nobody called the cops. Nobody complained. Karen was watching from her window, angry, bitter, but powerless. The lake had always belonged to the community, and now, finally, the community was taking it back. Still, there was unfinished business. Didn't want Karen to slink away and regroup. We wanted accountability. So we began drafting a motion to formally remove her from her position. On the HOA board, using the bylaw clause that allowed for removal due to abuse of authority and conduct detrimental to community welfare. It would take signatures. It would take proof. But we had both. And that's where things took an unexpected turn. Someone sent us an anonymous tip documents emails.
8.
And screenshots showing that Karen had been misusing HOA funds, paying herself. Reimbursements for security patrols and buying personal items under the label of community emergency resources. Suddenly, this wasn't just about phishing anymore. This was about corruption, fraud, and a pattern of intimidation that had affected more than just Grandpa. We were about to confront her with the truth, in this time there would be no yelling, no fake policies, and no empty threats to hide behind. The documents arrived in a plain manila envelope, slipped quietly into our mailbox without a return address. But the contents inside made the situation with Karen far more serious than we had initially believed. There were printed screenshots of emails between Karen and a third-party landscaping company, invoices marked urgent and priority, payment receipts made from the HOA fund to a personal PayPal account linked to Karen's name. It wasn't just about phishing rights anymore. This was evidence of financial misconduct. One invoice in particular stood out: $4,800 billed for security lake patrol services, a completely made-up role Karen had supposedly created and approved. Nobody on the board, not even those who had resigned, remembered ever voting on such a service. There were receipts for home improvement supplies labeled as community beautification, but the delivery addresses were traced to Karen's private residence. What had begun as a personal vendetta against my grandfather was quickly unraveling into a scandal that shook the entire neighborhood. The timing was perfect. We were already circulating a petition to formally remove Karen from the HOA board, and this new information only added fuel to the fire. I made several copies, handed them discreetly to key neighbors and former board members, and we scheduled a special emergency meeting with the remaining HOA members and our lawyer, who volunteered to help pro bono. Once he reviewed the material, word spread fast, and on the day of the meeting, the community center was packed. Nearly every homeowner showed up, most of them visibly angry. Others just stunned that someone they had trusted with neighborhood management could be capable of this level of dishonesty. Karen arrived 30 minutes late, holding her clipboard and trying to act composed, but the moment she walked through the doors, silence fell like a hammer. People parted without speaking to her, their expressions hard. The HOA chair, now one of the only two remaining board members not affiliated with Karen's inner circle, called the meeting to order and handed the floor to me. I didn't speak with fire or emotion. I let the papers speak for themselves. Read aloud excerpts from her emails, listed the falsified charges, and projected side-by-side comparisons of the invoices and bank transfers for everyone to see. There was no shouting. There didn't need to be. The room sat in a heavy silence that only deepened as I laid out the timeline and explained how she tried to bully an elderly man as a distraction from her abuse of funds. Karen stood frozen, her face twitching between disbelief and forced indignation. "This is slander," she finally muttered. "You're manipulating this entire community." But nobody stood up to defend her. Not a single person. One brave soul, Mrs. Holloway from Oak Street, stood up and asked Karen point blank, "Did you or did you not authorize payment to yourself for services that were never rendered?" Karen didn't answer. She looked away, then stormed out of the meeting, slamming the double doors behind her. That evening, over 70 homeowners signed the petition for her removal. It was more than enough. The next day, an official notice was delivered to her door by 2 former board members and a notary, effectively terminating her HOA position and banning her from future board eligibility. But that wasn't the end. He took the packet of evidence and submitted it to the County HOA Oversight Committee, which launched an investigation into Karen's activities. Her misuse of funds, falsification of board decisions, and personal harassment of residents put her under serious scrutiny. Meanwhile, the neighborhood slowly began to heal. The lake became a communal space once again. Grandpa returned to fishing regularly, often joined by families, kids, and even some neighbors who had once remained silent out of fear. One Saturday morning, the lake hosted a spontaneous thank you gathering for Grandpa. No speeches, no signs, just people coming together, grilling burgers, chatting, casting lines, and treating the water the way it was always meant to be used, freely and respectfully. Karen, on the other hand, refused to accept her fall from power. Even after her removal, she began mailing typed letters to homes accusing the board of corruption, claiming she was the victim of a conspiracy. She tried to contact news outlets, but nobody listened. Her attempts to stir up support backfired completely. Even her closest allies turned away, afraid to be associated with her. Eventually, she became a recluse, barely seen around the neighborhood. Her house, once pristinely maintained, began to look overgrown and neglected. It was as if the life she'd built based entirely on control collapsed once that control was taken away. She filed a civil complaint against the HOA, claiming emotional distress, but it was dismissed almost immediately for lack of merit. Her influence was gone, her power extinguished by her own actions. With the HOA now under new leadership, composed of people who actually listened to the community, changes began to roll out. Open forum meetings were scheduled monthly. Rule updates required full neighborhood votes. Transparency was prioritized over hierarchy. It was a fresh start. One of the first motions passed under the new board was the repeal of the fabricated fishing restriction. In fact, the lake was officially redesignated as a multi-use community area, open for fishing, kayaking, and small gatherings. A simple wooden bench was installed near the bank with a plaque that read, "In honor of peaceful mornings and those who never stop standing for what's right." Grandpa refused to admit it made him emotional, but we saw the way he touched it every time he sat down with his gear. But perhaps the most unexpected moment came a few weeks later. A man in a suit arrived at our door, introduced himself as a representative of the county's HOA Oversight Council, and handed Grandpa a certificate of community recognition for his resilience and commitment to neighborhood unity in the face of targeted harassment. It wasn't flashy, but it meant something. It meant that even the quietest, simplest people can shake the foundations of false authority when they refuse to be bullied. Still, as calm as things appeared, we knew the situation with Karen might not be over for good. People like her rarely go quietly, but we were prepared now. We had systems. We had neighbors who trusted each other. Most importantly, we had proof that when a community stands together, even the loudest, most controlling voice eventually gets drowned out by the truth. Just when we thought the storm had passed, another unexpected wave came crashing through the neighborhood. And this time, it wasn't just about Karen's abuse of power. It was about the very roots of the HOA itself. A week after the plaque was installed near the lake and Grandpa's routine returned to peaceful mornings of fishing, I received an anonymous email with the subject line, "You only dug halfway." Inside was a single attachment, a scanned document labeled HOA Formation Filing, Addendum C, dated nearly 15 years ago, long before Karen moved into the neighborhood. I opened it out of curiosity, expecting it to be just another outdated procedural form, but what I found made my blood run cold. The document appeared to be a modification to the original HOA charter specifically, a revision that shifted certain oversight powers away from collective homeowner votes and into the hands of a temporary executive committee. The odd thing? That committee had only 2 signatories. One was a known real estate developer, long gone from the area. The second, Karen. The date on the document predated her actual move-in records by 3 years. That didn't make sense. She shouldn't have been able to sign anything related to our HOA at that time. Confused but intrigued, I forwarded the document to the new HOA board and to our legal volunteer. 2 days later, the lawyer called me directly and said this changes everything. If this is real, we might be looking at fraud committed at the foundation level. That's when I realized Karen's influence hadn't just been about manipulation. It had been rooted in a lie from the very beginning. The board met in private and began combing through all archived HOA formation documents. What I had received, except the official HOA copy, didn't include Addendum C. That version had never been filed with the state HOA registry, meaning it wasn't legally binding. However, somewhere along the way, Karen had used this forged document to gain early control over the HOA leadership roles,
bypassing
typical elections, and appointing herself to the board under the justification of emergency oversight continuity. And for years, nobody questioned it. Most of the original homeowners had either moved or passed on, and the few who remained had no memory of ever approving that addendum. Karen had operated under a foundation of forged authority, allowing her to manipulate board seats, voting structures, and neighborhood policies for nearly a decade. That's how she managed to pass half the bizarre rules we were still cleaning up. Suddenly, all her actions made even more sinister sense, not just her power trips, but the fear she instilled, the threats she made, and the arrogance she carried. She truly believed she was untouchable because she'd written herself into the rules. The board called an emergency community meeting to present these findings. This time, they brought in a certified HOA auditor and a county legal representative to verify the documents in front of everyone. The room was packed again, and this time the air felt electric. Not angry, but expectant. People wanted closure. They wanted to know that the person who had ruled over them for so long under the guise of authority was finally being exposed for what she truly was. When the forged signature was shown side by side with Karen's official HOA application signature from years later, the match was obvious. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. She had signed herself into power before she even owned property. Here, the legal rep stepped up and explained that, under state HOA law, any foundational fraud invalidated all rules passed under that authority. That meant many of Karen's most oppressive policies, including the fishing ban, several home modification fines, and even 2 foreclosures she'd pushed forth, could potentially be reversed and wiped from record. The room erupted in whispers, then applause. Some people cried. For the first time in years, there was hope of undoing all the damage. Karen had done, but Karen didn't show up to the meeting, not this time. She'd gone silent since her removal from the board. No angry emails, no clipboard marches, no surveillance photos printed out and left in neighbors' mailboxes like she used to do. Her house remained dark most nights. Some said she'd gone to stay with relatives out of state. Others believed she was preparing a lawsuit to get revenge. But she wasn't done, not quite yet. Just 2 days after the community meeting, a local news truck pulled into the neighborhood. Word had spread beyond our quiet cul-de-sac. Journalists knocked on my door and asked if I'd be willing to share the story of how a grandfather's fishing trip exposed years of HOA corruption. At first, I hesitated. We weren't looking for publicity. But then Grandpa surprised me. He said, "Let them film it. If someone else is going through the same thing somewhere else, maybe this gives them the courage to stand up too." Did the interview? It aired that weekend, and our neighborhood story became a segment titled "The Grandfather, the Lake, and the HOA Queen Who Faked Her Throne." It went viral in local circles. The story drew sympathy, outrage, and support from HOA members across the state who recognized pieces of Karen in their own communities. What came next was the final blow to Karen's legacy. The state's HOA regulatory office launched an official inquiry into all HOAs where Karen had ever held board positions. It turned out she had been on 2 other boards in the past, smaller roles, but the pattern was the same. Her tactics, the intimidation, the quiet manipulation of documents, all consistent. She was banned from ever serving on any HOA board in the state again. Her forged addendum was entered into public record as evidence in a formal complaint. Legal consequences were now likely, especially if the misuse of funds and false representation could be prosecuted. The last rumor we heard was that she had listed her house for sale quietly through a private real estate broker. There was no goodbye, no admission, just a for sale sign that appeared one morning and a moving van that arrived before dawn a week later. When she was gone, no one celebrated, no one jeered. The neighborhood simply exhaled in relief and moved on. We thought we had seen the worst of it. Karen removed from power, her fake policies exposed, her fabricated HOA document entered into public record, and her silent departure marked only by a moving truck that pulled out before sunrise. But just when we believed the dust had finally settled, a deeper, darker truth surfaced, one that turned a story of neighborhood abuse and corruption into something far more sinister. It began with the HOA board's decision to bring in a third party forensic accountant to track and document every financial transaction Karen had authorized during her time in office. At first, we expected more of the same: inflated invoices, double billing for landscaping services, and her now infamous lake patrol reimbursements. But within days, the accountant uncovered something we never anticipated: a trail of redirected payments that had nothing to do with neighborhood operations. Karen had created a shell company listed as Community Resource Management and Safety, a name that sounded official enough to avoid suspicion. That fake company was receiving funds directly from the HOA budget, $500 here, $1,200 there, each labeled as a different HOA necessity: emergency flood prep kits, event permits, public safety fees. But the kicker was that this company didn't exist in any business registry, not at the state level, not with the IRS, nowhere. It was a ghost entity. And the bank account it was tied to? It led to a private online banking profile under Karen's full legal name. There was no denying it now. She had created a completely fraudulent company to embezzle tens of thousands of dollars from our neighborhood. The board was stunned. In total, the missing money amounted to just under $73,000 over the course of 6 years. The accountant's report laid it out line by line. Some of that money had been funneled into luxury home furnishings, confirmed through credit card statements and flag delivery receipts. Other amounts had gone toward travel, plane tickets to Arizona, hotel stays in California, and spa packages booked during peak HOA budget meetings she had missed due to illness. It all pointed to a long-running scheme of theft and cover-up that stretched back to her very first year on the board. That's when the board brought the findings to the county prosecutor. An official complaint was filed, and a legal investigation was formally opened. Karen, now residing in a small rented condo in another district, was issued a summons to appear in court. We later learned that she had no idea the board had retained a forensic accountant. She truly believed she'd gotten away with everything. Right up until a court officer knocked on her temporary apartment door. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. While most people were still stunned, many weren't shocked, just validated. For years, she had made people feel like criminals for painting their fences the wrong shade or putting up wind chimes too close to shared property lines. Now she was the one being investigated, and this time, it wasn't a slap on the wrist or a petition to remove her from a meeting. It was a felony-level embezzlement case. Grandpa kept to himself through all of it. He still fished by the lake, still waved to neighbors, still drank his black coffee every morning on the back porch, never once bringing up Karen by name again. He didn't need to. The new HOA board, now composed entirely of volunteers voted in by the residents, formally honored him at the next community meeting. They gave him a plaque, not one of metal, but of solid cedar engraved with his name, and a thank you for preserving the soul of our community. It was installed at the lake, next to his favorite fishing spot. A small bench was added beside it, and nearly every morning, someone in the neighborhood stops by to sit with him for a moment, to ask how he's doing, or just to enjoy the quiet water. Karen's house, now up for resale after being repossessed through legal order, sits empty. A foreclosure sign was posted not by the HOA, but by the bank. Once pristine and policed to perfection, the lawn is now overgrown. A few weeds poke through the stone pathway she had once cited others for having. It stands as a hollow shell of the power she once clung to, a reminder to the neighborhood that control gained through fear always crumbles when exposed to truth. When the trial finally arrived, several neighbors were called as witnesses. I was one of them. I stood in court and recounted the day Karen called the police on Grandpa for fishing. The footage from that day, Grandpa sitting quietly, rod in hand, Karen yelling in the background, was played for the jury. It was surreal. The courtroom was silent except for the audio of that calm, unnecessary chaos. The prosecutor built the case carefully. First her abuse of power, then the fake documents, and finally, the financial trail of embezzlement. Her defense team tried to argue that she had simply made clerical errors and acted in the best interest of community order, but no one was buying it. Not when the paper trail showed purchases from luxury boutiques and five-star resorts labeled as outreach materials. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours. She was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, document falsification, and misuse of community funds. Sentencing was scheduled a month later. We didn't attend that part. We didn't need to. Justice had already been served the moment the truth came out. She was ordered to repay the full amount and banned permanently from holding any leadership position in housing associations or neighborhood councils. Her real punishment, though, was the legacy she left behind, not as a leader, but as a cautionary tale. Today, the lake is more than a body of water. It's a symbol. New families move in, hear the story, and nod in appreciation when they pass Grandpa by. The new HOA board hosts seasonal picnics there, and kids are taught how to fish, just like Grandpa used to do with me when I was little. We've even established a community transparency committee to ensure no future board can ever repeat the mistakes of the past. A copy of Karen's forged document is now framed and displayed at every annual HOA meeting, not out of bitterness, but as a lesson, a reminder of how quickly power can be corrupted when no one is watching. But we're watching now. We're united, alert, and stronger than ever, all because one man refused to be pushed off a dock with a fishing rod in his hand. This story started with a quiet morning and a cruel accusation, but it ended with the restoration of a neighborhood soul. If you've ever lived under the weight of an unjust HOA, or felt powerless in the face of someone who misuses authority to control others, remember this: all it takes is one voice to stand up. One person to say that's enough, and once that happens, others will follow. Let this story be your spark. For more powerful real-life HOA battles and stories of standing up to injustice, make sure to subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel because truth always rises. The fight for fairness never ends.